Louis Althusser NLB. Chapter 1 A Revolution in Method. It is a received truth that Montesquieu is the founder of political science. Auguste Comte said it, Durkheim repeated it, and no one has seriously disputed their judgment. But perhaps we should step back a little in order to distinguish him from his ancestors, and to see clearly into what it is that thus distinguishes him. For even Plato stated that politics is the object of a science, and we have his Republic, Politics and Laws to prove it. All of the thought of antiquity lived in the conviction, not that a science of politics was possible, which is a critical conviction, but that one could go ahead with it straight away. And the moderns themselves took up this thesis, as is clear from Bodin, Hobbes, Spinoza, and Grotius. Of course, the ancients should be criticized not for their claim to reflect on the political, but for their illusory belief that they had produced the science of it. For their idea of science was borrowed from their own knowledges. And as the latter, with the exception of certain areas of mathematics, not unified before Euclid, were no more than immediate glimpses or their philosophy projected into things, they were complete strangers to our idea of science, having no examples of it. But the moderns. How could the mind of a Bodin, of a Machiavelli, of a Hobbes or of a Spinoza, the contemporaries of the already rigorous disciplines triumphing in mathematics and physics, have remained blind to the model of scientific knowledge that we have inherited? And in fact from the 16th century on we can see the birth and growth in a joint movement of a first, mathematical physics, and of the demand for a second, soon to be called moral or political physics, which aimed for the rigor of the first. For the I-8 opposition between the sciences of nature and the sciences of man was not yet in season. The most metaphysical exiled into God this science of politics or history, which seemed to be the conjunction of the chances of fortune and the decrees of human freedom, Leibniz, for example. But all that is ever handed over to God is the errors of man, and Leibniz entrusted to God the human idea of a science of man. As for the positives, the moralists, the philosophers of law, the politicals, and Spinoza himself, they did not doubt for a moment that it was possible to treat human relations like physical relations. Hobbes only saw one difference between mathematics and the social sciences: the former unites men, the latter divide them. But that is only because in the former the truth and men's interests are not opposed, whereas in the latter whenever reason goes against man, man is opposed to reason. Spinoza, too, intended that human relations should be treated in the same way as natural things, and by the same routes. For example, take the pages that introduce the political treatise. Spinoza denounces the pure philosophers who, as the Aristotelians do with nature, project into politics the imaginary of their concepts or ideals, and he proposes to replace their dreams with the real science of history. How then can we claim that Montesquieu opened routes which we find completely mapped out well before him? In fact, if he seems to follow known routes, he is not going to the same objects. Helvetius says of Montesquieu that he has Montaigne's cast of mind. He has the same curiosity and takes the same matter for reflection. Like Montaigne and all his disciples, collectors of examples and facts hunted out from every place and time, he takes as his object the entire history of all the men who have ever lived. And this idea did not come to him altogether by chance. We must imagine the double revolution that shook the world at the turn of the 15th and 16th centuries. A revolution in its space. A revolution in its structure. It is the age of the discovery of the earth, of the great explorations opening up to Europe the knowledge and the exploitation of the Indies east and west and of Africa. Travelers brought back in Montesquieu, politics and history eyed their coffers spices and gold, and in their memories the tale of customs and institutions which overthrew all the received truths. But this scandal would have had the impact of a mere curiosity had it not been for the fact that in the very heart of the countries which were thus sending forth their ships for the conquest of the new lands, other events, too, were shaking the foundations of these convictions. Civil wars, the religious revolution of the Reformation, wars of religion, the transformation of the traditional structure of the state, the rise of the commoners, the humbling of the great, these upheavals, whose echo can be heard in all the works of the period, gave the material of the scandalous tales brought back from across the seas the contagious dignity of facts real and full of meaning. What had previously been themes for compilation, extravaganzas to appease the passions of the erudite, became a kind of mirror for the contemporary unease and the fantastic echo of this world in crisis. This is the basis for the political exoticism, known history itself, Greece and Rome, becoming the other world in which the present world seeks its own image, which has dominated thought since the 16th century. Such is Montesquieu's object, too. As he says, the objects of this work are the laws, the various customs, and manners, of all the nations on earth. It may be said, that the subject is of prodigious extent, as it comprehends all the institutions received among mankind. One, it is precisely this object that distinguishes him from all the writers who, before him, had hoped to make politics a science. For never before him had anyone had a daring to reflect on all the customs and laws of all the nations of the world. Bossuet's history does claim to be universal, but all its universality consists of is the statement that the Bible says everything, all of history being in it, as an oak is in its acorn. As for theoreticians like Hobbes, Spinoza or Grotius, they propose the idea of a science of history rather than working it out. They reflect not on the totality of concrete facts but either on some of them, Spinoza on the Jewish state and its ideology and the eye. A defense of the spirit of laws, Part 2, the general idea. 20 Theologico-political treatise, or on society in general, Hobbes in De Cive and Leviathan, Spinoza himself in the political treatise. They do not produce a theory of real history, but a theory of the essence of society. They do not explain any particular society, nor any concrete historical period, nor a fortiori all societies and all history. They analyze the essence of society and provide an ideal and abstract model of it. We might say that their science is as far from Montesquieu's as the speculative physics of a Descartes is from the experimental physics of a Newton. The one directly attains in simple natures or essences the a priori truth of all possible physical facts, the other starts from the facts, observing their variations in order to disengage their laws. This difference in objects then governs a revolution in method. If Montesquieu was not the first to conceive of the idea of a social physics, he was the first to attempt to give it the spirit of the new physics, to set out not from essences but from facts, and from these facts to disengage their laws. Hence it is clear both what unites Montesquieu with the theoreticians who preceded him and what distinguishes him from them. He has in common with them the same project, to erect a political science. But he does not have the same object, proposing to produce the science not of society in general but of all the concrete societies in history. And for this reason he does not have the same method, aiming not to grasp essences, but to discover laws. This unity in project and difference in object and method make Montesquieu both the man who gave his predecessors scientific exigencies the most rigorous form, and the most determined opponent of their abstraction. The project of constituting a science of politics and history presupposes first of all that politics and history can be the object of a science, i.e. that they contain a necessity which the science can hope to discover. It is therefore necessary to overthrow the skeptical idea that the history of humanity is no more than the history of its errors and divagations, that a single principle can unite the prodigious and daunting diversity of manners and morals, man's weakness, that a single reason can illuminate the Montesquieu, politics and history 21 infinite disorder, man's very unreason. It is necessary to say, I have first of all considered mankind, and the result of my thoughts has been, that, amidst such an infinite diversity of laws and manners, they were not solely conducted by the caprice of fancy, S.L. Preface, but by a deeper reason, which, if not always reasonable, is at least always rational, by necessity whose empire is so strict that it embraces not only bizarre institutions, which last, but even the accident that produces victory or defeat in a battle and is contained in a momentary encounter. To this rational necessity rejects, along with the skepticism which is its pretext, all the temptations of Pascal's apologetics, espying in human unreason the admission of a divine reason, and all recourse to principles which surpass man and man, like religion, or assign him ends, like morality. In order to begin to be scientific, the necessity which governs history must stop borrowing its reasons from any order transcending history. It must therefore clear from the way of science the pretensions of a theology and a morality which would like to dictate it their own laws. It is not for theology to pronounce on the truth of the facts of politics. An old argument. But it is hard to imagine today the weight of ecclesiastical decree on history. It is enough to read Bossuet's campaign against Spinoza, guilty of having outlined a history of the Jewish nation and the Bible, or against Richard Simon, who had the same project inside the Church itself, to see the conflict between theology and history, and its violence. This conflict occupies the whole of the defense of the spirit of Lamb. Montesquieu was accused of atheism, of deism, of not having mentioned original sin, of having condoned polygamy, etc., in short, of having reduced laws to purely human causes. Montesquieu replies, to introduce theology into history is to confuse orders and mix up sciences, which is the surest way to keep them in their childhood. No, his aim is not to play the theologian. He is not a theologian but a jurist and a politician. That all the objects of political science may have a religious meaning, too, that too. SL. X. 13, The Battle of Pultowa, Considerations on the Causes of the Grandeur and Declension of the Roman Empire, ch. XVM. 22 Celibacy, polygamy and usury can be decided on theologically, he would agree. But all these facts derive also and first from an order foreign to theology, from an autonomous order which has its own principles. Let them therefore leave him in peace. He does not forbid anyone to judge as a theologian. Let them therefore grant him in exchange the right to judge as a politician. And let them not go seek theology in his politics. There is no more theology in his politics than there is a steeple in the telescope through which the curate was shown the moon. 3 Thus religion cannot stand in for science and history. Nor can morality. Montesquieu takes the utmost care at the outset to warn against understanding morality when he says politics. The same for virtue. Tt is not a moral, nor a Christian, but a political virtue, sl. Advertisement. And if he returns a dozen times to this warning, it is because here he runs up against the commonest prejudice: in all countries morality is requisite, ibid. Hobbes and Spinoza said the same thing: all the duties in the world do not constitute the beginning of a single knowledge. In his morality, which wants to make the man he is the man he is not, man only too obviously admits that the laws that govern him are not moral. Hence a determination to reject morality is essential if these laws are to be penetrated. Human and Christian virtues are held up against Montesquieu when he attempts to understand the scandalous usages of the Chinese and the Turks. It is not usual to crowd these questions into books of natural philosophy, politics and civil law. For here, too, distinct orders must be distinguished. All political are not moral vices, and all moral are not political vices. SL. X 9, 2. Each order having its own laws, it only lays claim to laws of its own. He replies to the theologians and moralists that he only wants to speak humanely of the human order of things, and politically of the political order. He defends his most profound conviction, that a science of politics can never be founded except on its own object, on the radical autonomy of the political as such. 3. A defense of the SL. Part 1,11, Answer to the 9th objection. 4. A defense of the SL, Part 11, on climate. Montesquieu, Politics and History 23. But the cause is not yet understood. For it is not enough to distinguish the sciences and their orders; in life the orders overlap one another. True religion, true morality, supposing that they are excluded from the political order as explanatory principles, do nonetheless belong to that order by the conduct and scruples they inspire. Here the conflict becomes an acute one. For it is easy to render morality unto morality and to judge only as a pure politician. That is all right when one is writing about the horrifying morality of the Japanese or the terrifying religion of the Turks. All the theologians in the world will leave them to you. But when by chance one encounters the true morality and the true religion, can one treat them, too, humanely, as purely human things? Show that the Christian religion and morality, like those of the pagans, can be explained by the political regime, 2 degrees of latitude, an over-harsh sky, the manners and morals of merchants and fishermen. Is it permissible to print that it is the difference in climate that has preserved Catholicism in the south of Europe and spread Protestantism in the north? Can one thus authorize a political sociology of religion and morality? The contagion of this evil imposes a return to its source, and the theologians are seen to be the victims of the fate accorded to Muhammad or the Chinese. For it is all right for false religions to be no more than human, and to fall beneath the profane empire of a science, but how can this empire be prevented from gaining the true religion? Hence the theologian who quickly scents the heresy in an overhuman theory of false religions, and Montesquieu who struggles and defends himself in the terribly narrow margins separating his convictions as a believer, or his dishonest precautions, from his exigencies as a scientist. For there is no doubt but that, on many occasions, Montesquieu expounds in his examples the complete argument of a true sociological theory of religious and moral beliefs. Religion and morality, which he correctly refuses the right to judge history, are no more than elements internal to given societies which govern their forms and their nature. The same principle that explains a given society also explains its beliefs. What, then, is left of the distinction of two foreorders? The distinction, if it is to be maintained, and it has to be, traverses, then, the order of religion and morality itself. Religion can be said to be understood in its human meaning and role, which can fall within a sociology, or in its religious meaning, which falls outside any sociology. That is how Montesquieu retreats, in order to avoid jumping. Hence the accusation of atheism, and the weakness of his defense. For if he gave his answers vigor, he could not give his arguments power. Someone tries to convict him of atheism. His only argument, would an atheist write that this world, which goes on its way and follows its laws alone, was created by an intelligence? Someone argues that his position amounts to Spinozism and natural religion. His only reply, natural religion is not atheism, and anyway, I do not profess natural religion. All these defensive stands could not deceive his opponents or allies. Besides, the best defense he presents of religion, the encomium he openly makes to it in the second part of the Spirit of Lamb, is as much that of a cynic as that of a believer. Take the polemic against Bayle. Bayle argued that religion is contrary to society, that is the meaning of the paradox about the atheists. Montesquieu counters that it is indispensable and profitable to society. But by doing so he remains within Bayle's principle, the social function, the social and political utility of religion. All his admiration amounts to is to show that the Christian religion, which lays claim only to heaven, is very well suited to the earth. But all the politicals use this language, and Machiavelli first of all. In this completely human language, faith does not find its birthright. Quite different arguments are required to win over a theologian. However, these two principles preliminary to any political science, that it is impermissible to judge history by religious or moral criteria, that on the contrary it is essential to rank religion and morality among the facts of history and subordinate them to the same science, do not radically distinguish Montesquieu from his predecessors. When all is said and done, Hobbes and Spinoza spoke the same language, and were treated as atheists in the Montesquieu, Politics and History 25 Same way. Montesquieu is unique precisely in taking the opposite position to these theoreticians, although he was their heir, and opposing on one decisive point the theories of natural law of which they were for the most part the proponents. Let me specify this point. In his book on political theory, Vaughan shows that all the political theorists of the 17th and 18th centuries were, with the exception of Bacon and Montesquieu, theoreticians of the social contract. 8. What does this exception mean? In order to decide, we must make a rapid survey of the theory of natural law and of the social contract. What unites the philosophers of natural law and of the social contract is the fact that they pose the same problem: what is the origin of society? And solve it by the same means, the state of nature and the social contract. It may seem very strange today to pose such a problem of origins and to wonder how men, whose physical existence, even, always presupposes a minimum of social existence, could have moved from a zero state of society to organized social relations, and how they crossed this primordial and radical threshold. And yet it was the dominant problem of political reflection of the period, and if its form is strange, its logic is profound. To show the radical origin of society, we are reminded of Leibniz, wanting to pierce the radical origin of things. Men must be taken before society, in the emergent state. Rising from the earth like pumpkins, said Hobbes. Naked, said Rousseau. Stripped not only of all of the instruments of art, but above all human bonds. And they must be grasped in a state which is a negation of society. This emergent state is the state of nature. Certainly, the various writers give this primordial state different characteristics. Hobbes and Spinoza see in it the reign of the state of war, the strong triumphant over the weak. Locke claims that the men there live in peace. Rousseau, in an absolute solitude. The different features of the state of nature sometimes suggest the reasons why men will have to leave it, at others the springs of the future social state and the ideal of human 5. C. E. Vaughan, Studies in the History of Political Philosophy, Volume 2, pp. 253 ff. 2.0. Relations. Paradoxically, this state, ignorant of all society, contains and illustrates in advance the ideal of a society to be created. It is the end of history that is inscribed in its origin. Thus the freedom of the individual in Hobbes, Spinoza, and Locke. Similarly, the equality and independence of man in Rousseau. But all these writers have in common the same concept and the same problem: the state of nature is no more than the origin of a society whose genesis they want to describe. It is the social contract that ensures the transition from the negation of society to the existing society. Here again it may seem strange to imagine the establishment of a society as the effect of a general convention, as if every convention did not already presuppose an established society. But we must accept this problematic since it was held to be a necessary one, and only ask what this contract means, this contract which is not a mere legal artifice but the expression of a very profound rationale. To say that the society of men emerges from a contract is indeed to declare truly human and artificial the origin of all human institutions. It is to say that society is the effect neither of a divine institution nor of a natural order. It is therefore above all to reject an old idea of the foundation of the social order and to propose a new one. It is clear what opponents are implied by the theory of the contract. Not only the theoreticians of the divine origin of all society, who may serve many causes though most often that of the established order, but particularly the proponents of the natural, and not artificial, character of society, those who believe human relations to be planned in advance in a nature which is no more than the projection of the existing social order, in a nature in which men are inscribed in advance in orders and estates. To say what is at stake in a word, the theory of the social contract in general overthrows the conviction peculiar to the feudal order, the belief in the natural inequality of men, in the necessity of orders and estates. It substitutes a contract between equals, a work of human art, for what feudal theoreticians attributed to nature and to man's natural sociability. It is therefore generally a fairly sure index of discrimination between tendencies to consider that the doctrine of natural sociability or the instinct sociability designates a theory feudal inspiration, and the doctrine of the social contract a theory of bourgeois inspiration, even when it is in the service of absolute monarchy, in Hobbes for example. Indeed, the Ideatinen are the authors of their society in a primordial pact, which is sometimes duplicated into a pact of civil association and a pact of political domination, is thus a revolutionary idea, echoing in pure theory the social and political conflicts of a world in Genesis. This idea is both a protest against the old order and the program for a new order. It deprives the established social order and all the political problems then in dispute of any recourse to nature, at least to that inegalitarian nature, denounces a fraud in it and bases the institutions its authors defend, including absolute monarchy and struggle against the feudal lords, on human convention. It thus gives men the power to reject the old institutions, to set up new ones and if need be to revoke or reform them by a new convention. In this theory of the state of nature and of the social contract, apparently pure speculation, we can see a social and political order that is falling, men founding on ingenious principles the new order they hope to defend or erect. But these features of polemic and petition so characteristic of the theory of natural law explain precisely its abstraction and idealism. I said above that these theoreticians were restricted to the model of a Cartesian physics which knew only ideal essences. And those who would like to judge Montesquieu by comparing him with Descartes, as has been done, or Newton, reduce him to an immediate but abstract appearance. This model of physics is only an epistemological model here, its true arguments are partly external to it. If the theoreticians I am discussing do not take Montesquieu's object, to understand the infinite diversity of human institutions in all times and places, it is not simply because of the mere aberration of a method inspired by the Cartesian model of science, but also for motives of quite another Gustave Lanson, L'influence de la philosophie cartésienne sur la littérature française, Revue de métaphysique et de morale, année 4, 1896, pages 517–50. Especially pages 540–6. Montesquieu, Politics and History 27–28 import. They did not have the idea of explaining the institutions of all the peoples of the world, but of combating an already established order or of justifying an order which was nascent or about to be born. They did not want to understand all the facts but to found, to propose and justify, a new order. That is why it would be aberrant to look in Hobbes or Spinoza for a real history of the fall of Rome or of the emergence of feudal law. They were not concerned with the facts. Rousseau was to say openly that it is essential to start by laying facts aside. 7 They were only concerned with rights, i.e. with what ought to be. The facts were for them only the matter for the exercise of this right, and in some sense the mere occasion and reflection of its existence. But here they remained in what must really be called a polemical and ideological posture. They made the side they took the very reason of history. And their principles, which they presented as science, were no more than values committed in the struggles of their time, values which they had chosen. I do not say that all was in vain in this gigantic undertaking. Its effects can be demonstrated, and they are considerable. But it is clear how far Montesquieu's proposals distance him from these perspectives, and in this distance his arguments are more clearly distinguishable. They are twofold, political and methodological, both tightly linked. Let us reflect, then, on the absence of any social contract in Montesquieu. There is indeed a state of nature of which Book I of the Spirit of Laws gives us a very rapid glimpse, but no social contract. On the contrary, have never heard anybody talk of the law of nations, says Montesquieu in the 94th Persian letter, but he carefully begun with inquiring into the origin of society, which appears ridiculous to me. If men did not form themselves into societies, if they avoided and fled from each other, it would be right to ask the reason, and to inquire why they kept themselves separate. But they are born united to one another. A son is born near his father, and there he continues. Here is society and the cause of it. This says every 7. Discourse on the origin of inequality among men, in the Social Contract and Discourses, translated by G. D. H. Cole, p. 161. Montesquieu, Politics and History 2 Graham's Thing. A condemnation of the problem of origins as absurd. Society always precedes itself. The only problem, if there must be one, though it is one never encountered, would be why there were some men without society. No contract. To explain society, a man and his son are all that is required. It is thus hardly surprising to find, in the rapid review of the state of nature in Book I, that a certain fourth law stands in for this absent contract, the instinct of sociability. Here is a first indication pointing the way to a judgment of Montesquieu as an opponent of the theory of natural law for reasons related to a party P as of the feudal type. All the political theory of the spirit of laws will reinforce this conviction. But this conscious rejection of the problem and of the concepts of the theory of natural law leads to a second indication, no longer of politics, but of method. Here undoubtedly stands revealed Montesquieu's radical novelty. Rejecting the theory of natural law and the contract, Montesquieu at the same time rejects the philosophical implications of its problematic, above all the idealism of its procedures. He is, at least in his deliberate consciousness, pulls apart from judging the fact by the right and proposing in the guise of an ideal genesis an end for human societies. He only knows facts. If he refuses to judge what is by what ought to be, it is because he does not draw his principles from his prejudices, but from the nature of things. S.L. Preface. Prejudices, the idea that religion and morality can judge history. This prejudice was in principle in harmony with certain of the proponents of natural law. But also a prejudice, the idea that the abstraction of a political ideal, even dressed up in the principles of science, can stand in for history. In this Montesquieu broke absolutely with the theoreticians of natural law. Rousseau made no mistake about it, the science of politics is and probably always will be unknown. In modern times the only man who could have created this vast and useless science was the illustrious Montesquieu. But he was not concerned with the principles of political law, he was content to deal with the positive laws of settled governments, and nothing could be more different than these two branches of study. Yet he who would judge wisely in matters of 3 actual government is forced to combine the two. He must know what ought to be in order to judge what is. 8. The Montesquieu who refuses precisely to judge what is by what ought to be, who only wants to give the real necessity of history the form of its law, by drawing this law from the diversity of the facts and their variations. This man is indeed alone in facing his task. 8. Emile, translated by B. Foxley, v. pages 400.